The concept of a tool is it's an element external to you that helps you in achieving something. And so a tool is something you use. At the moment, the tool uses you. You are the tool. So don't do that. The Startup Podcast is excited to partner with Until Now, an incredible product and brand studio with proven experience in developing successful businesses and brands, including the iconic Airtasker, Karma, Spriggy, and Path Zero. We're putting our money where our mouths are on this one. Until Now even redesigned our brand. We think it looks fantastic, and we're beyond impressed with the process and people. Whether you're a startup, scale-up, or corporate venture, Until Now runs a cross-functional approach to solving your product, brand, and go-to-market challenges. Head to their website for more examples and to get in touch.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast, a show focused on helping you build, run, and invest in Silicon Valley-style startups. Whether you're an investor, founder, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights on the principles that power high-growth disruption the way Facebook, Google, and Uber do it. The conversation starts now.
Hey, I'm Chris.
And I'm Yaniv.
And I'm Oliver.
Today, we're discussing good planning with Oliver Heckmann, VP of Engineering at Coda. Before Coda, Oliver had a stellar career at Google that culminated with his being Vice President in charge of Google Shopping. Oliver was my manager back when we were both at YouTube, and he remains the best manager I've ever had the pleasure of working with. He's a fantastic leader of people, a deep strategic and organizational thinker, and, relevant to this episode, a master planner. Oliver, it's such a pleasure to be reconnected and have you on the podcast. Please tell our audience just a little bit more about yourself and what you do.
Thanks, Yanni, for the great introduction. I'm Oliver Heckmann. I'm from Germany originally. And at Google, I'm sometimes known as Oliver from Zurich because I spent a good chunk of my Google career in the Swiss Zurich office. That's where I worked with Yaniv. But I've moved to Silicon Valley 8 years ago. Like Yaniv mentioned, I've worked on YouTube originally and ran Google Shopping and Google Travel for many years. Left Google a bit over 2 years ago to join Coda, a Silicon Valley startup.
Now, planning is something that everyone has to do, but it's so rarely done well. I think it's also very rarely enjoyed. It's something that people just kind of feel like they have to take their medicine. And so I think this is a really important topic and something that doesn't, well, I guess it gets discussed a lot, but not in the right ways a lot of the time. So you've actually made this episode really easy for us by writing 10 commandments of good planning. So what I thought we would do is we'll go through them one by one, but first, maybe just by way of introduction, tell us a bit about why you felt you had to come up with this list and your process of putting it together.
There were multiple actually reasons that led to the list. One was when I joined Coda, I took over the planning process. And planning was something I was always fascinated by. So I happily volunteered to run that for Coda. But also our product itself is used by many of our customers for their planning process. So I also have the opportunity to just learn from our customers how they're doing their planning. And that led to many ideas and insights that I would have not come up with by myself, but also to many people sharing their problems and their concerns. And all of that again culminated in me running a series of events over the last month around planning. And then I got the idea, well, I could take all the lessons learned from the different events that I run together and cut it down to 10 pieces and call them the 10 Commandments.
It's funny how summarizing something in like a BuzzFeed list really captures people's imagination. We'll probably use the 10 Commandments line in the show name. Yeah. It's really clickbaity to do it that way.
But they're great. Let's just jump in from the top. I love all of them. The first one really talks to me, which is thou shalt plan both top down and bottom up. So what do you mean by that?
So let me start with the bottom up and why that's important. Bottom-up planning is when you involve basically all the employees in the company in planning. That is, especially in a startup, absolutely critical. Why would you pay so much money and put so much investment in recruiting only the best people if then you're ignoring their opinions and all their brain power as you're drafting up the plans? That is why bottom-up planning is crucially important. At the same time, if you have great people that come up with a lot of ideas of what could be done, and it will be way too much for even well-resourced companies to do all of those bottom-up plans. So there's a strong strategic element needed in giving very clear direction and making sure that all these bottom-up plans are drafted in the right direction. Nobody's too massively overcommitted. That's why a good planning process involves a top-down motion and a bottom-up motion. And most good processes need to go top down, then bottom up again, and then top down to further refine, and then bottom up again to check that everything is fine. So it's not that you go once top down and one's bottom up, but you tend to go through those motions at least twice in plan.
We've actually discussed this kind of process maybe twice before on the podcast, particularly in the episode around managing your scale up, planning, and alignment. And that's absolutely the process we used at Uber and a process I've used in a number of scale ups I've advised, where the leadership team sets the high level context. What are the global business OKRs, if you will? What is the thing we're all trying to achieve? And then each squad responds with their squad level OKRs that might contribute to that. And then there is an alignment review that helps review the squad level OKRs and goals, not just for alignment with the goal, but also for ambition and for collision and for redundancy. That kind of top down, bottom up, top down review little dance is just so powerful.
Yeah, I typically call it what we call alignment phase, the integration phase. That's basically when you put all the pieces together and check for overlap and check for the missing pieces. Help teams not try to do too much.
And a lot of dysfunction you see from companies is just this one bullet, right? They're either doing too much top down with no bottom up, or too much bottom up with no context from the leadership, or even they do both the first two, but then nobody in leadership calibrates and aligns. And so a lot of dysfunction just comes down to this very simple little mechanic. I love it.
Exactly.
It's fascinating because I think, first of all, it's often presented as a dichotomy, which is why I like this commandment, right? It's like, you have a choice. You either do top down or bottom up. And that's not true. And then, also once you do that, traditional companies tend to be more top down and disempower the employees. And so I guess more startup-y sort of companies that are looking for a more modern management methodology are often about, we want to empower our people. So we're going to have a bottom-up process. But then what you find is you get that lack of alignment, which we talk about a lot. We've had an episode on alignment that we keep referencing back to. And you just don't have an overall strategy, an overall direction that you're going to. And then I guess that missing piece, like you said, is structure. Because if you say, if we have both top down and bottom up, you don't want them to sort of crash in the middle in a messy way. You need that structured process. And actually, Lenny Rachitsky, our podcast big brother, Lenny's podcast, wrote a great article a few years ago. He called pretty much what you're talking about the W process. And that's because the way you resolve it is with this sequential structure where you have top-down setting of context, bottom-up ideation and planning, then top-down integration and validation, and then bottom-up buy-in. And I think that is really important. So for anyone listening here, this doesn't have to be a heavyweight process. And this is not about leading by consensus where everyone has an equal voice, but it's making sure that all the voices are heard and that all of those smart people are able to have input.
Exactly. There's one more thing to point out very explicitly, and the W model expresses that clearly, because it's what do you start with, top down or bottom up? There can sometimes be the inclination from the executive team to, let's do the bottom up first, because then we have all the ideas on the table and then we pick from them. But that's a very wasteful thing, because you have to typically say no to most of them. And also it's typically not well received to plan completely without guidance. Much better to give guidance first, so to start with top down, then do bottom up, and then refine with top down again.
That's so interesting, because that does happen a lot. And what I like to say is that's an active classification rather than an active strategy definition, right?
Yeah.
So take all the ideas and they start to classify them into things, where strategy is about the elimination of ideas and it's about choosing a very specific set of things to go do. And so you're right, you either end up discarding all the ideas anyway, or you end up just classifying everything and having too much on the table, and you haven't actually, that's not planning at all.
Exactly.
Okay, let's go on to the next commandment. Commandment 2, thou shalt not plan for the future without reflecting on the past.
Yeah, and that's actually why I will argue it's actually not a W, like we just discussed, but it's actually an M, because you're typically not starting at 0 when you're planning. You just had a previous planning period, previous quarter, if you do quarterly planning. So it is important to first reflect on what went well previously and what didn't go well, and have that influence the top-down guidance. If you're not learning from past things, then either it's the assumption that you're perfect or that you're not able to adapt, and both are dangerous.
So one of the things we've talked about a lot on the podcast is that fundamentally, when you're running a startup is a learning machine. And what we mean by that is we start off with a hypothesis about the world, and we want to de-risk that hypothesis iteratively until we're at the point where we've actually been able to raise capital and build a big, significant business in the world. And when you're planning, it can be really tempting every planning period, whether you plan quarterly or whatever it is, to start with a blank slate, to say, okay, we're done with the last quarter. Let's have a think about what we want to do this quarter and not worry about the past and all the mistakes that we made, which we always do, and all the things that went wrong. We have a blank slate and it's really exciting. But that's always a mistake. When you think about it in the context of a learning machine, every planning period should be built on a basis of the new learnings that you got from the previous period and the period before that and the period before that. It's really important to reflect, to digest what has happened in the previous quarter, to learn from that, to add to your base of learning, to your base of de-risking, so that when you plan for this quarter, you have actually learned more, you know more, and therefore you hopefully going to be able to make a better plan, a less risky plan because of that new knowledge that you've gained.
Also, the other thing is typically in that reflection, we can quickly come up with a lot of things to improve. Like always, when you're trying to improve something, pick one or two and double down on them and don't try to improve 100 things in parallel. I think it's much higher chance of success to really double down, which is also why the process you're using, the tooling you're using should be constantly refined.
So I think this would be a great time to move on to commandment 3, which is thou shalt not blindly copy someone else's tool or process. I love this one.
Yeah. So every company has specific strengths, has specific challenges, and that will also constantly change over time from maybe early ideation to the different stages of a startup. The challenges will be very different. And therefore, basically, how you run planning have to evolve inevitably. And I think it's a huge danger to just say, oh, whatever, Google was successful with using this OKR framework, so we'll just copy that framework and apply it exactly the same to our company because then we'll become as successful as Google. That's just a big fallacy.
We've been talking quite a lot about OKRs, but of course, this episode isn't just about OKRs specifically, but about planning in general. And a lot of this discussion reminds me of the whole Scrum industrial complex, or, all of these sort of industries that have come up around the agile principles and the Scrum methodology. And so often what you see here is that the process has been elevated, where you go, okay, this is how Scrum is done, or this is how OKRs are done. But the underlying principles, whether it's the Agile Manifesto or the Lean Startup, the underlying principles behind those processes are not digested, not understood. And so what you're doing is you're copying a process without understanding why that process is the way it is. And when you do that, you get all of the burden of the process, but very little of the benefit. And it becomes nearly a pastiche of how the process should actually be, because you don't understand why you're doing. You're just blindly mimicking what someone else told you to do.
Yeah, and I think the key word here is blindly. It's not saying do not copy. You should completely copy. There's many good things you can take and you should copy, but do it basically with conscious thinking about it, not blindly. I think the OKR frameworks is a fantastic planning tool. There's no doubt. It was one of the key rituals we had at Google. And I have zero doubt that it was a key element of why Google achieved so many so ambitious goals, especially early on in their years. Just goes hand in hand with the way that we did OKR-based planning at Google. But taking that and blindly applying the same thing and hoping for the same outcome is just not the same thing. Typically, what's the very concrete challenge that you want to address in planning? Maybe it's idea generation, because we talked about that earlier. In that case, you want to really strengthen and build out the bottom-up planning aspect. Maybe dedicate more time to it, put more emphasis on it, run that longer, and pay more attention to it. Or very often it's an alignment issue, which depends on where exactly is the alignment problem. Is it a high-level alignment? Then that first top-down guidance that you're doing, that's basically the key phase. Before that phase kind of runs, where you fix that. Or is it alignment that gets in the way of execution between the teams, in which case, because they're depending on each other and they're getting blocked by each other, it's a different alignment problem and something you can fix, frankly, ideally in that second top-down phase.
So like you, Oliver, I came out of Google with a great love for and appreciation of OKRs, and I've been using them and trying to implement them at every company I've worked at since. And one of the things that I've really learned that has been a valuable but quite a painful learning is that OKRs as an artifact, or even as a planning process, are like the tip of this very big iceberg, where most of it lies under the surface. And what I mean by that is that effective OKRs are built on a cultural understanding and a set of principles for how the startup is run or how the organization is run. It's about being comfortable with uncertainty. It's about prioritizing outcomes over outputs. It's about having a really clear understanding of a company's priorities and setting those objectives so that you actually know what's important to the company and organization. Now, what tends to happen when OKRs are blindly, again that word, transplanted to an organization that doesn't have that cultural understanding and that set of priorities and way of thinking and way of doing things is, just like I said before, you get all of the burden with none of the benefit. And instead of thinking clearly about your objectives and what a good outcome looks like, what you'll take is the existing roadmaps, the existing laundry list of tasks, and you'll kind of aggregate them as key results into a set of OKRs. And you kind of have something that looks like OKRs, but offers none of the benefits of OKRs, because you're just basically putting these things together into an OKR format after the fact without applying the principles and the thinking behind what makes OKRs powerful at some of the most successful Silicon Valley companies.
I mean, to put it in a very stark terms, it's like putting lipstick on a pig, right? They don't understand the sponsoring thoughts, the underlying principles, and all of the cultural changes that need to happen for OKRs to be the right tool to execute planning.
Yeah, it is a big part of the OKR process. You said that correctly. You start with the objective. So where do you want to go? I often feel like it's a bit like when you're learning mountain biking. Like they'll tell you, well, you have to look where you want to go and not where you're currently steering to. So it's basically that objective comes first. First, you look at where you want to be. But in the end, the outcome of planning, like after planning comes execution. And execution is basically when you have like a list of tasks and people work down those tasks. And how the high-level objective gets broken down into all the actual tasks that people will then spend hours, days, weeks on actually executing, like how that happens and what's the capability of the team to do that very, very much depends. If you set too abstract of an objective and then you say, oh, no, our planning is done. Yeah, we set an ambitious objective and the team isn't set up or hasn't learned how to break that down into actionable tasks and then take action on it, then you've just wasted a whole bunch of time.
So one of the themes here is really around processes that become, it's like the tail wagging the dog. And with OKRs, I've really felt this. I used to be a lot more dogmatic about the format, right? You have your objectives and then a set of key results that need to be measurable outputs and whatnot. I've often found it to be a lot more painful than I would like it to be, right? Setting OKRs can end up being like a real wrestling match. You're like wrestling a pig in mud and you come out the other end and you feel grubby and exhausted. And I've reflected on the reasons for this, right? And so OKRs actually consist of 3 components, right? The first is the objectives, and the objectives are the thing that need to come first, right? You need to say, okay, what is important for us to be prioritizing, to be working on at this time? If you don't know what your objectives are, then everything else is kind of meaningless. You don't know what you're devoting your resources and your attention to. And then you've got your key results, and your key results can again be broken down into 2 parts. The first part is choosing what the metric is. From the world of potential measurements that you might be able to use to measure your progress towards the objective, what you want with your key results is metrics that have the best fidelity, that are able to most accurately capture the spirit of the objective, where you say, if we hit these key results, that means we've met our objective. But of course, a key result is a metric, but it's also a target, right? It's also saying, we want this metric to hit this value, right? We want our customer onboarding time to go down from 14 days to 5 days. So the target is 5 days in this case. Now, what I found, especially at earlier stage startups, is setting the objectives is really valuable, but setting the key results is actually quite a lot less valuable and quite a lot more work than you would think. And there are a bunch of reasons for that. One is, it's one thing to say this is the metric we'd like to use. It's another thing to actually be able to measure it meaningfully. And quite often what I found is you set a key result, but then you realize you can't measure it properly. And that's really frustrating. And then you either basically abandon it or you end up in a situation where you have to put a lot of work into measurement, more work than is justified by the value that key result is bringing. And the other thing is the target, especially at an early stage where you don't have any kind of repeatable motion, where you don't have any track record. Setting a target for these values is often just an absolute shot in the dark. And because different people have different priorities around how you use this target, it can end up being a bit of a food fight as to how you set it. And ultimately, the value of having a clear target turns out not to be that high for an organization that is simply trying to align around where it should be investing its efforts, what experiments it should run, just going into the great unknown and making sure that you're focusing on the right things. And so what I've found is at the early stage, it is the objectives that are by far the most valuable. And I'd recommend trying this. Just set the objectives and the key results. If you've got the capability to set and measure key results, fantastic. But often just having that clear statement of these are our objectives at the moment. These are the things that we're focusing on. And therefore, all the other things that we could be doing, we're not focusing on them, that's enough to drive the alignment that is really the value of OKRs.
Yeah, a lot of startups either don't have the tooling or instrumentation in place to measure a KR, or they don't have statistically significant results anyway, so there's nothing to measure, or they're starting from a blank piece of paper, they haven't built anything yet. And so they're not trying to incrementally move a KR, a key result. They're trying to invent some new capability whole cloth. And so, yeah, I like that very much, Inev. I think the KR part of OKRs for very, very early stage companies is probably overcooking the process.
Exactly. It's actually, we're going to get back to that when we talk about number 7, but could not agree more. The one thing I would add is, like, the earlier stage you are, the more degrees of freedom you have. So the tougher part of planning is figuring out the objective. And the later you become, you have existing customers and there's an existing revenue stream that needs to continue to grow. And there's pretty clear expectation on how that needs to grow and so on. Well, then the objectives are still hard, but not quite as hard anymore. But now it comes to the key results. If you just think about how planning typically happens, there's a whole bunch of information that is needed for someone to really understand the full plan.
So now let's move on to commandment number 4. Thou shalt not spread planning information across different places. I'm feeling a bit of shame right now, but Oliver, tell me why this is so important that it makes it as a commandment.
First, if we think about what's planning information, there's a whole bunch of information typically. It's probably emails from leadership to give like the guidance, or maybe it's a presentation or it's a document somewhere. Then there's some helping material, customer insights or feature requests from customers, top issues, and so on. Then there's the actual OKRs, given that almost everybody is doing OKR-based planning, which is typically a table or multiple tables filled with many, many rows of objectives and key results. There's likely a final presentation of that. What very often gets presented as the plan is then that OKR table or a view of that OKR table in the end. But that's missing a whole bunch of information that for someone to really understand the plan is pretty critical. You can imagine, I don't know, you're coming in as a new leader or you're coming in as a new employee and you're trying to figure that out by just reading through the OKR table. You'll probably understand a bit of what they're doing, but you'll not understand why, because missing that information, and you're not understanding, well, what are they not doing? What would be the next thing they would do that they decided against? All that information is very insightful, especially for leaders to be aware of.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be in that final OKR presentation. And also the problem with that is that email that has a top-down guidance, you're not going to find that 3 months later. You're probably not going to find that the next week. Yeah, or that presentation link to that. You'll be looking through it and it says Q1 presentation, but it's whatever, the Q1 presentation from 2 years ago and so on. That's why the commandment is basically keep all of that in one place, put it all in a single place so that it's all together and you don't go hunting for it.
So this is really about putting the final artifact, the OKRs or whatever they are, along with all the context that led into those OKRs.
Exactly.
And the bit that really stood out to me when you mentioned it and it resonated is you talked about, the decisions about what not to do. Because ultimately, the hard part of prioritization is not deciding what to do. It's deciding what not to do. And as you say, unless you explicitly make it a part of the process and the documentation of the process, it's not an artifact. And if you don't have those explicit boundaries saying we're not doing this, we know it's cool, we know it's valuable, we know it's important, we know our customers want it, but we made an explicit decision, this other thing is more important, so we're not doing it. Of course, you could say that's implied. If it's not one of your objectives, it's not one of your objectives. But I think there's a lot of power in saying we considered this and we made a choice to say no to it for now.
Exactly.
The way we solved for this at Uber was to not present just the OKR table, but rather present what we called the narratives. The narratives were often a deck of some kind or a doc, but it would include, what is the strategy? What is our view of the world? What is our principles or pillars or what have you? What are the possible pathways? All the context you need to explain what is probably the last slide or one of the last slides, which is what are the OKRs of the team in the context of all of that? And then maybe some last next steps or blockers or yellow flags or something. And so that artifact ends up being the thing you present in the alignment meeting and the thing that you refer to throughout the quarter as you're kind of holding the team accountable.
Yeah, that's fantastic. We do it quite similarly. And then store that together with the OKRs.
Well, I would actually say that the OKRs were in the deck. And so
you were stored in it. That is perfect. Yeah, then you've stored it in one place.
Yeah. And you mentioned many, many rows of OKRs. We also talked about on this show a few times, really there should be 3 or 4 O's and 2 or 3 or 4 KRs. Like it shouldn't be lots and lots and lots of rows, right?
The way I'm solving it in our company is we have basically like a hierarchical thing here. Yeah. And at the lowest level, that information is hidden. People outside the team don't need to understand those KRs. They're just for the team, and they can break them down in as much detail as they need. It's completely up to them. It feeds into their execution, and they have complete freedom to tune it to how they can best execute. But at a higher level, we're limiting the number of rows that people need to read, because people cannot read 100 rows, impossible.
So let's now move on to number 5, which is thou shalt not plan in a separate place than you execute. What do you mean by this one?
We touched on this a tiny bit before, and that is, in the end, you're doing planning, not for planning's sake, but planning is there to guide execution. And execution is basically when it then gets decided whether the plan was good or not. So there's this close tie from planning to execution. At the same time, often it's done somewhat separately, or you have planning, it leads to some OKRs. And then I remember actually was guilty of that many, many times before. Planning was finished at Google. Now we did something completely different for 6 weeks. And then I got a reminder, you actually have to go back to your OKRs and update them. And then I go back there and realize I've forgotten about a small percentage of them, completely forgotten about them. And then we kind of huddled to get that together. And then you forget about for another 6 weeks until the quarter's finished. And you reactivate that again. That's clearly not optimal way for that plan to really do what its job is, which is to guide the execution. So it's much better to then actually store those plans or the outcome of those plans, let's say the KRs, in the same place that you're actually running your execution from. So let's say you're running your execution in a weekly meeting on Monday mornings, then that's also where the KRs should end up showing up. And it should be visible, and it should be looked at in that case every single Monday morning, and any updates in the meeting should ideally directly reflected back in the KRs, and not after 6 weeks when you go to a completely different tool.
I'm often telling the companies that I advise, coming up with the plan is really hard. That's a really hard part of my job, to help you come up with a plan and to think through the strategy. An equally hard part of the job is to operationalize the plan and to mitigate strategic drift. Both of those things are really hard. And oftentimes you'll find startups that are in a loop of planning, where they plan, fail to execute plan, fail to execute plan. And the next new hire, the next new person, the next new whatever is, I've got a plan, boys and girls. And that's not the problem you have. The problem you have is the plan is probably not specific enough, but the operations and execution are not happening off the back of the plan.
The way I think of it is the plan needs to be living. I think an even more egregious example of where this takes place is when you talk about companies that define company values and things like that, and put a lot of thought into it. You have focus groups, whatever. You write down your values, you print them on a beautiful poster, you stick that poster on the wall, and everyone just walks past it every day and completely ignores it because you've not operationalized it. And so I think with values, that's very stark, but with plans, something similar happens, right? You're like, our OKRs are done. We've put them on a slide. We've had a company all hands. We've talked through them. We've put them somewhere on our internal Coda. See what I did there? Then everybody just ignores them. You get like plan blindness. It's nearly like, even if you have them in the same place, in the same way that people get banner blindness, where they're like, okay, here's an ad, but I'm just not seeing the ad because I'm focused on the content. Even if you have your plans in the same place as your execution, if the plans don't feed the execution in a meaningful way, if they're not part of the process, they will still fade into the background and fail to come to life. And I don't have a perfect solution for this, by the way. I'm still a student of how to really do this well.
I don't have a perfect solution either, but one thing that's helpful, while not perfect, is like in my weekly kickoff meeting, for example, I visualize the KRs. And I have that visualization just rendered as cards. But it's sorted by progress, with the most complete one at the beginning and then towards the bottom, the least completed ones. And we go through that at the beginning of the meeting. We just look at it a bit like a leaderboard. We celebrate who's first, but we can actually also then guide discussions about where we're lagging behind. And suddenly, not every week, but regularly, it influences actually the agenda of the meeting. And suddenly, the plan has actually informed how we're shaping this week.
One thing we've tried to do is, whatever our planning tool is, we tag them with one of the objectives. That's part of defining the ticket. So if you don't know what objective that ticket is working towards, then at the very least, you need to pause and have a conversation about whether you're doing it. And I guess both your example and my example are beyond having them in the same place. How do you actually bring them into the process? Today, I'm here with Dilip, a principal engineer at Until Now. Speed is super important in the early days of a startup, but of course, you also want to make sure that things don't break. How do you make that trade-off?
Mother of all questions, isn't it? The reality is that things will break. The question is, did you expect it or not? The early stages of any startup are about making the right trade-offs and going into things with eyes wide open. When designing a new solution or feature, you actually work on a spectrum. On one end, you're running the risk of incorporating code and delaying valuable new learnings. On the other, you are running the risk of eroding the little trust your early adopters have placed in your startup. So I believe the most efficient approach will be a risk-driven, just enough architecture solution. So you ask questions like, are we shipping to learn something new? What is the level of confidence in the solution? What are the risks involved and where it's going to break? The answer to all these questions gives us more context and helps to make the right trade-offs required to build the right solution.
Whether you're a startup, scale-up, or corporate venture, Until Now runs a cross-functional approach to solving your product, brand, and go-to-market challenges. Head to their website for more examples and to get in touch. Shall we move on then to Commandment 6? We are now round the bend. Thou shalt not confuse goals with stretch goals.
Yes. The number one question I get is, should we write our OKRs so that we complete 0.7 or that we hit the 1.0? And for background, for people who haven't worked at Google we wrote OKRs in an ambitious way and achieving only 70%, and they were created on a scale from 0 to 1. So 0.7 meant we had achieved 70% of what the goal was. That was considered a success. That's become unpopular for a number of reasons. So most companies that I've been involved are not doing it like that. They just write the OKRs and what they're actually trying to achieve this quarter. And if they achieve that, it's considered 100%, and any score below it is considered some failure. And one of the negative side effects of writing an OKR in one way, but being fine with only achieving 70% is very hard for other teams that rely on that KR to be completed. Building a new storage system, and the old storage system has an OKR to be switched off at the end of the quarter, and the new one is going to be ready at the new quarter, but then their success is measured. Well, they didn't quite get there. They got it 70% completed. Because suddenly you've turned off the old one and you haven't built a new one yet. And if that sounds crazy, it sounds crazy, but this has happened many, many times at Google, where we transitioned to systems that weren't quite ready yet and already turned the old ones down. That's why most companies aim at 100%, makes tracking those dependencies and relying on them a lot easier. But also then you're losing the advantage of being able to set really ambitious goals where you're not then held responsible if you can't achieve them. And that's where this commandment basically comes in. I typically give the advice, it depends a bit on the situation your company is in and scale. I normally say most companies should probably write their goals as actual goals they want 100% completion on, but should have the freedom to write stretch goals as well and clearly mark them as stretch goals, where they say, we'll try to achieve this, but this is a stretch goal, so we're perfectly clear here that we will very likely not achieve it, even so we'll still try hard. Then you get the motivational boost, the ambition, but also the flexibility from writing stretch goals where you don't need to be perfect in predicting.
The only thing, though, in my experience, Oliver, with stretch goals is they never get achieved. Like, as soon as things get a little bit challenging, which they always do, the stretch goals get thrown out. I think that's the challenge there. If you don't integrate stretch goals into your actual goals, you're all but guaranteeing that they won't be achieved.
I think the trick here is to make sure that the goals that are being set, the primary KRs, are in themselves ambitious. And that comes from that leadership alignments phase of the planning, which to push the squads and really get them to set good goals, and not goals, as you said, that are like 0.7, 0.8 is okay. Like, no, we want you to hit this higher goal. Stretch goals, I'm a bit indifferent whether they're there or they're not there. But what you said reminded me, Oliver, about good OKRs, I think, should not be binary. Like, we turned it on, we turned it off. Or rather, should not be about dates and the activation or completion of a service. They should be more about, instead of we do 100% of this new service, it should be we've onboarded 3 customers onto the service. So that suggests not only does it have to be complete, it has to be complete enough that a customer can onboard.
One problem is you're not done when you're launching. You're launching it because you want to land it somewhere. So the ultimate goal of anything you launch is to land it in the right place.
To me, what this suggests is there value in having targets? And I think the answer is it depends, right? When you break down OKRs, to continue what I was saying earlier, right? You have your objectives, and sometimes you can just stop at the objectives. But the key results themselves are also broken down into 2 further parts, right? There is the metric, and then there is the target value of that metric. So you've got customer onboarding time as your metric, and then 7 days to 3 days, that's your target value. And sometimes the target value is important, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes you just want to say, we really want to improve customer onboarding. We're going to measure that. We're going to try to make the onboarding period as short as possible. And adding a target to it, whether it's a stretch or not a stretch or whatever, it doesn't actually help the teams plan or execute in any meaningful way. And so sometimes it's worth saying, well, you know what, we're just going to bring it down as far as we can.
I think that's sometimes true, Yanev, but the interesting thing about a goal, or rather a specific number in the KPI, is that it helps the team understand what is the order of magnitude. Like, are we open to a step function change? Like, let's rewrite the onboarding wizard and rethink this. Or is it sufficient to squeeze out a 1-2% gain? And oftentimes teams will often be comfortable with a 1 or 2 or 3% gain when you're like, guys, we should be able to double or triple the throughput through this thing. And why are you aiming so low? And why is your work product so mediocre?
Let's go on to Commandment 7 then, which is thou shalt not waste time on success metrics when success is obvious, or rush success metrics when success is not obvious.
I like that.
So this is sometimes a bit, by purist OKR fans, a bit controversial, because I tell you, sometimes it's perfectly fine to just set a goal of launching and moving on and not spending any more minutes talking about the metrics. And at other times, that's the biggest mistake you can make. For example, in a perfect world, a success metric would be something that is an output metric so that you see that what you've achieved has really had the impact, the system that you're changing. So you'd ideally, in a perfect world, measure the output, and ideally you would be able to measure it directly with no feedback delay. In reality, often you're doing something that helps the marketing team, and that will translate into more visitors and then eventually more sales calls. And some of these calls will convert into free accounts, and then they'll convert into paid accounts. And a year and a half later, you'll be able to measure the revenue impact. Doesn't help you anything to measure the success of that specific launch because there's a feedback delay and an attribution delay. You're never gonna trace that conversion a year and a half later back to that launch. So then you compromise on input metrics that more directly relate. You might just track a number of calls, a number of visits. If the final objective you're going for here is revenue related, it's an input metric. There's a whole system between translating into revenue, but it's easier to track and there's a shorter feedback loop. So that's what often gets done. And my argument here is to basically sharpen that a bit more and says there are certain things where I do not have the capability to measure it, or instrumenting the measurement will take you on the same order of magnitude as actually building the thing. And then you need to make a call. Is it really obvious that this will move things in the right direction? And the only question is how much it moves it. Do you need to understand that? Or you just double down on execution, get it done and move on to the next thing? Or is it, as you're tuning a complicated system, do you actually really need to understand it?
This nearly goes back to the commandment about not blindly copying processes. You don't blindly copy them and you don't blindly apply them either. I've been guilty of this, I think, in the past with planning and execution tools like OKRs, but this episode isn't all about OKRs. I think this is just as common with sprint planning and Scrum and things like that, right? You see this situation where a process that was designed to support a certain way of working becomes sort of hardened and ossified, and then you end up with the tail wagging the dog, where rather than saying, okay, we created this process to support this way of working, the process starts to dominate, and you say, we have to do it this way because the process says this is how we have to do it. And with OKRs, it's like we have to have output metrics. You can end up twisting yourself into a pretzel. To your point, Oliver, it's like, okay, the output metric, we're not going to see it for a year. So what do we do? And you have meetings and discussions and like all of this stuff. It's like, oh, okay, you know what? Maybe it's just not that important. Either it's too hard to measure, or we know what success looks like, or we can think of some input metrics, or we actually just say this is a delivery goal where we just want to ship the thing and then see what happens because, we're putting conviction behind it. Really, it comes back to that piece of like, okay, the concept of a tool is it's an element external to you that helps you in achieving something. And so a tool is something you use. At the moment, the tool uses you. You are the tool. So don't do that.
Yeah, and this is something we speak about a lot, right? It's what I call cognitive inertia, or the lack of first principles thinking, where people get into this groove. Well, my manager asked me to do this, or this is a process we always run. I like what you said, Yanev, you become the tool. It's so hard to do this. And I've given this example before on the podcast where the team I was running at Uber had historically been gold on certain outcomes, certain metrics. Of course, the OKRs for that quarter were rooted in those metrics. And about halfway through the quarter, I realized these are dumb metrics. These are dumb goals. This is not the most powerful thing the developer platform can be doing for Uber. There was this come to Jesus moment where amongst a whole cross-functional leadership team, I finally said, exasperated, I don't give a shit about the metrics, because they kept on trying to bring it back to the metrics. And that was sacrilege at Uber, right? It was like to not care about the metrics. But I finally had to blurt out the most confronting thing I could, because we kept coming back to the metric. And I'm like, this is the wrong metric. It's the wrong goal. I don't care about the planning cycle. I don't care what we agreed on. We learned this is wrong. So we're going to throw the process out and we're going to do something else. From the users you're trying to serve, to the peers you're trying to work with, to the leaders who are ostensibly helping you achieve a goal, there's this inertia that you have to be hyper vigilant about. And it's the hardest thing in the world sometimes to push back on, but push back on it you must.
I sometimes compromise a bit here in reality. I say, okay, we've still data driven. We're arguing about the metric for now. We put down as the metric, so you know it when you see it.
I love it.
I love it.
And we'll have an argument next week on whether we keep that as the metric or whether we have made more progress and we can start to instrument one.
You mentioned being data-driven, and actually speaking to my previous point, our head of data back at Airtasker said we don't want to be data-driven. We want to be data-informed, because data-driven means the data's driving you. You want to stay in control. So the data is there, but if you give up your agency and your accountability to the data, then you're not doing your job. But anyway, Chris, you had nearly the perfect segue, I think, to commandment number 8 about forget the metrics, right? Which is commandment number 8 is thou shalt not etch your plans in stone.
Yes, because whenever you're finished writing, the world has changed. It's kind of inevitable that whatever planning horizon, things change and some of the plans no longer make sense. And now there's like multiple options that you have. Like one thing could be you just follow the plan because it's been written and not consider changes in the world until the next planning cycle starts. But if that planning cycle is 3 months, that's an awfully long time to be going down the wrong path. The second option is you start ignoring the plan because it's no longer valid and you just try to do the right things without the plan. Or the third option is, while you change the plan, just adopt the plan. In the end, it's text that's written somewhere in a table that you can just change. If you're not adapting to the changing world, that's a problem. And if you start adopting but not adapting the plan, then you just train everybody to ignore the planning. So just adjust the plan if needed.
Can you imagine a world where planning was set in stone and then ChatGPT comes out?
Yeah.
Everyone's like, oh yeah, we'll just stick to the plan. It's fine. And it's like, no, have a think again.
I'm just going to keep riffing on my point of giving up your agency and your accountability to tools. The plan itself is a kind of tool, right? If you say, okay, I've set the plan and now I'm just going to do what the plan tells me to do, instead of saying, okay, I've got this plan and then I need to work with the plan, but new input, new data is continuously coming in. There's that quote, sometimes it's attributed to John Maynard Keynes, sometimes to Winston Churchill. When the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do? Right? And there's this idea of like, okay, the facts are always changing. In startups, the facts are always changing. If they're not, then you're not actually delivering product enough because you're getting new facts in, right? So when the facts change, you change your mind. And if you change your mind, you should change your plan. Now, I have personally one caveat here, which is what's the difference between changing a plan and I think, Chris, you called it strategic drift. It's about the level of intentionality. I think when you change the plan, there's nearly a little ritual you should go through where we say, we are changing the plan. The plan was X. The plan is now Y. The plan is not something that can just sort of evolve in this sort of slippery, organic way. I think plan updates are discrete and thoughtful and intentional things that need to happen and be clearly communicated in that way.
Jana, if I want to put a little plug in for, I think, a revelation we had on the podcast live as we were recording, I think, in one of the early episodes where we discovered that startups are all about agency. You know, your business model should not be dependent on gatekeepers. Your team should not be dependent on sign-offs or check-ins. The squads should be autonomous. And individuals should not be attached to plans when their agency, their intelligence, their experience, their intuition, their new data tells them something has shifted. And I thought that was like, that bent my mind when we figured that out together. Or this idea is like, startups are about recursive agency all the way down. And I think that's so, so important. It's so powerful an idea. And I think it applies here as well.
Just one other thing about this commandment, maybe before we move on, which is I think that etching plans in stone is actually, I don't know what you think, Oliver. It feels to me like a sign of management insecurity. It's this attempt to have control and certainty in an uncontrollable and uncertain environment. And that's actually kind of immature and insecure to try to do that.
There's two reasons typically for why people argue that they don't like to change the OKRs. One is the plan is used too extreme as a performance management tool. So they say, oh, if we just allow people to adjust the plan, they'll not achieve the goals because they'll just change them. But that's another dysfunction when you're trying to solve performance management or other problems through planning and you're making everything worse that way. The other one is if the organization can't make sticky decisions and then there's a worry that all the discussions that were done in planning kind of keep going after the plan is written. So that's typically a sign of two other dysfunctions that are not solved by etching the plans in stone, but that you actually solve by solving the actual root cause.
Okay, so let's move on to number 9, which is thou shalt not spend more than 10% of your time planning. Why 10%?
Let me tell you the story first of why I wrote this down. When I joined Coda, there were a ritual of 2 weeks planning, followed then by the rest of quarter execution. These were quite intense 2 weeks, but it felt long. And one experiment I did after I was at Coda for long enough that I had the courage was to basically change it down to a single week. The main goal of a plan is the execution. And if you're planning, you should be basically doing nothing else. And we want to, in the end, maximize the output of the company. So we want good plans and then as much execution as possible. The theory was basically if we have an additional execution week, we can get more done. I wasn't convinced that the second week of planning was adding as much value to the quality. So we shortened it down to a single week. And surprisingly or not surprisingly, the actual plans that got delivered in the week were actually better. And better, I mean a very meticulously tracked percentage of KRs, 50% or lower before that hit 100% and so on. But by whatever metric you slice it, including happiness surveys, a survey that we sent to our employees, everything said the shorter planning period led to better planning, higher happiness, and better business outcomes than longer planning. So why is the number 10%? Well, the 10% is made up because it's a round number and we have 10 fingers, and because 20 is too much. I get a regular pushback on this one where people say, oh, but we need 2 weeks minimum for this and that reason. It's always worth actually then digging in why that's the case. If a planning process needs, let's say, a long time because, well, you actually start to only gather customer feedback when planning has started, it's a problem. It's a given, but you should always do that and collect that. You don't have to analyze it every single day perfectly, but that should be a continuous process to listen to customers. By the way, if you do that, you also avoid all kinds of biases, recency bias, and so on. But anyhow, if it's a large company and it takes 2 weeks because alignment is hard and there can only be so many meetings that happen in the week, I would argue, well, then consider planning for 6 months instead of 3 months, instead of spending the team's 20% of the team's time. If you can get all the planning done in a day, well, you have the luxury to adjust the plans every month.
It makes a lot of sense. And I think what this is a reminder that execution is what matters. And planning is so important because if you don't plan properly, you don't have alignment, you don't have thought into what you're executing. But until you turn your plans into deliverables, then they are worthless, right? And so if you spend too much of your time on them, you end up with not enough time to execute and it slows you down. So it's really nice to have that forcing function. So Oliver, let's move on to the final commandment. Thou shalt not confuse OKRs with strategy or vision.
Yes, we touched a tiny bit on that before. Often people have a process, like an OKR process, and they run through that and then they're done and happy and so on. But there needs to be a strategy that describes how the company wants to move to that vision, factoring, resourcing, and so on. And then there's the other step of breaking this down into concrete objectives and concrete key results that you want to move towards that. And then afterwards, turning that into your execution mode to the actual tasks. All of that is needed. If you run a great OKR process, but you lack strategy and vision, you will not be successful. At the same time, if you have a fantastic vision, but no way to turn that into actual actions later, equally likely to fail.
You're making a distinction between strategy and tactics, in a sense.
Yeah.
It's like your vision is your ultimate long-term goal. Your strategy is your long-term approach to hitting that goal. And your OKR is, okay, working backwards from that long-term vision and in alignment with that strategy, these are the things we're going to focus on now. We've talked in previous episodes about the critical importance of sequencing, which doesn't get spoken about anywhere near enough, which is one of the most important parts of planning is what order you do things in. And OKRs and shorter-term plans are really a manifestation of saying, this is the next thing that we think we should do in that ordered set of things that we are doing in pursuit of our strategy.
Yeah, it defines the high-level actions taken in the coming planning period.
Fantastic, Oliver. So thanks so much for talking us through your 10 commandments. I guess I should ask, have you published these anywhere or are you planning to? If people want to look these up, where's the right place to go?
So I'm using them in the event series that I'm running. So if someone is interested in more information there, probably shoot me an email at oheckmann@coda.io. They get used in that event series where we kind of go in a smaller group and dig into specific problems that participants have. Also planning to write this up in an article and publish it somewhere.
Fantastic. We'll put that email address in the show notes, so hopefully people can reach out if they want to go in deeper. But even if not, hopefully this overview, really digging into your many years of top quality experience, Oliver, planning at different levels of granularity at different size organizations. This is hard-won experience. And so thanks so much for sharing it with everyone.
Thank you, Oliver.
Thanks for having me.